What up, Misfits? Welcome to the Misfit Heroes podcast. My name is Chris, and together we are going on a journey. Now, Misfits, there's an art to this podcasting game. Every 2 weeks, I bring new and exciting guests on to share their insight into the causes that they strive toward and the change that they want to see out there in the world. And that takes a lot of effort. It's a bit of a passion project, so to speak. And my guests tonight put a lot more effort into it than I did. And it's led to some real-world change. Courteney Stuart and Rachel Ryan are the hosts of the Small Town Big Crime podcast, a true crime series revolving around cold cases in their area. Their thousands of hours of dedication to their work has led to crimes being reinvestigated and potentially solved that were nearly 40 years old. Over a 20-year career as investigative journalists in print, radio, broadcast, and now podcasting, they've covered thousands of cases and helped bring light and justice to numerous cases in their area. And now they want your help. So, of course, I wanted to share the story with the world. We discussed their investigative process and the personal effort uncovering a decades-old cold case takes, insight into the crimes that were covered on the first season of their hit podcast, Small Town Big Crime, and how you can get involved with their hunt for justice in the future. All right, Misfits, it's time to dig for some clues. Please welcome Courteney and Rachel.
Playing the Misfit Heroes podcast.
All right, well, ladies, welcome to the podcast. I've been listening to your podcast for the last couple days. It's interesting. I'm not really a true crime person, so to speak. I'll just be completely honest with you right up front. And but the stories that have been going on your show have been just have been really compelling to me. I don't know why. Every now and then I'll get like caught up in something, and you guys have sort of stuck with me for the last couple days. So welcome to the show. How are you all doing today?
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, for sure. So Courteney and Rachel, they are the podcasters of the Small Town Big Crime podcast. And it's a true crime series about a case, I believe, that happened in Bedford, Virginia. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Bedford County. Yep.
Okay. So, the quality of the podcast is sort of directly related to your sort of experience as journalists. And I want to jump into that right from the start. So what, for the both of you, Courteney and Rachel, what sort of started this whole journalism journey for both of you? I guess we'll start with Courteney. When did you get into journalism, and like what made you want to be a journalist from the start?
Well, so Chris, I never took a journalism class. And so I graduated from college in the early to mid 1990s. And I spent several years after that trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I thought about law school and med school and being a dolphin trainer and going into fashion and you name it. And I couldn't decide. And finally, I went to a career counselor after a couple of years. And she said, I think you're a journalist. And I lucked into an internship at a local paper in Richmond, Virginia. And really within like probably one day, I knew that I had found my niche. It was just, I felt like I belonged. It was like my curiosity, every itch was scratched. And so that's where I got my start in print. And since then I spent, 15 or so years as an investigative print reporter. Then I jumped over to television broadcast news. And now I'm a radio host and a podcaster too.
How about you, Rachel?
I'm kind of the opposite. I always knew I wanted to be a journalist and I went to school for journalism. And my first job out of college was in Charlottesville, Virginia at the local CBS affiliate. And so I started off as a producer, reporter, anchor, and I always knew about this other reporter in town named Courteney Stuart who worked for The Hook, which is like this really cool investigative paper in town. And then she ended up coming over to work at CBS 19 on air with me, and we kind of briefly overlapped. And then I had kids. And so it just was hard to be like a full-time reporter at a local TV station with little kids. I started freelancing and then had this idea to start a podcast. And I asked Courteney if she would do it with me. And luckily she said yes.
Yeah, that probably wouldn't go too well with a toddler running around, the crime scene.
Well, we have done a lot of podcast investigating with toddlers running around.
Yeah. Rachel is literally the ultimate multitasker. I am blown away by how she is able to juggle small children and gruesome crimes all in one fell swoop.
Yeah. So is crime what you guys always wanted to cover, like right from the start, or was there ever, Courtney, you said that you weren't like really invested in journalism until you sort of caught the bug a little bit. Was crime what you guys like were always into?
No, I think I started off in sports, but then I think this is true for both of us, and that's what's made it so fun to do this together is we're really into storytelling and telling good stories and like learning about people and characters and being able to write to what we're learning, right, Courtney? Like
Absolutely. And also I think we share, I mean, while true crime as a genre is certainly really popular, I think ours is a little bit different because we are not interested in telling stories about cases that have been solved just for the sake of telling a really horrifying story. We are looking for cases that are unresolved in some way and something that we can hopefully bring some new information, some new light, maybe even, get some answers for grieving families. And so that's really the motivation, I think, for both of us.
Yeah. So, you said you started in broadcast journalism. Well, I mean, print, and you guys have done it all, print and broadcast and, radio, you said. So what made you want to sort of step into the medium of podcasting in general?
I think for me, it was the idea of being able, like, if you're in journalism, like local television, most of your stories are a minute or 2 minutes, and you have to do them that day. Like, there's not a lot of time to do research and investigate and do longer format. And so the idea of having a podcast where you could spend time investigating and researching and writing really good episodes, but then also having the sound where you could actually let people have their voices. It's really rich. We have a lot of people in this first season with like really rich Southern accents, and it just like adds a lot to the characters. I feel like you can see them in your head when you listen, and it's just cool to be able to do audio and be able to write. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and for me, a podcast was a chance to get back to long form investigative reporting because that's what I had built up to, especially when I was at the Hook newspaper. I would write, 3,000, 5,000 word investigative pieces week after week after week. And then I switched over to television. And like Rachel said, 1 to 2 minutes turnaround that day. So the depth was gone. So when she came to me with this idea for a podcast, it thrilled me because it was a chance to get back into that really rich storytelling.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I love about the podcasting medium too. You get this sort of long form conversation, and it seems like in the news, like if I watch a news story on TV now, even something like a presidential debate or something like that, that's pretty important, right? And it seems like even with that, it's like you get like 5 minutes of 10 people yelling at each other and then a 30-second ad for Tide, like it's weird how that works out. So how different is that? I mean, how much research actually goes into what you guys are doing on the podcast?
So we started off, we chose the case of Jens Soring, who was convicted of a double murder in Bedford he was convicted in 1990. The murder happened in 1985. And we had both covered it as journalists because it stayed in the news over the years. Like when he was in prison, maintained that he was wrongfully convicted. And a lot of people were helping him to try to exonerate him, like the Innocence Project and the sitting sheriff in our town. And so we'd covered the case. And I think we both thought we knew the story. And then we start researching and investigating on our own for this podcast. And we had no idea. And so we've spent, I don't even know how many hours at this point.
Thousands of hours, thousands. Over 3 years. And it was all self-funded. And so, I mean, really, truly, each episode, if you count up the hours we both put into the traveling to interview sites, poring over documents, it was a couple hundred hours per episode, at least, if not more.
Yeah. It's really crazy how in depth and sort of this deep dive that you guys go into as well. In the interest of full disclosure, I haven't finished season 1 yet, so no spoilers. Okay.
Okay.
But like I said at the beginning, true crime, it's not really my kick. I'm not drawn to it. I'll tell you a little story. So like my last job that I was at, the first day, I'm riding around with somebody in their car, and they had their phone kick over to what they were listening to on their Bluetooth and the speakers. And this is like the first 10 minutes I'm meeting this person, and it comes into whatever true crime podcast she was listening to at the moment. And it's like, and then they stabbed him 43 times with a knife. And I'm like, what's going on with this girl? Like, what's going to happen with me? So, I mean, I know you've been doing investigative journalism in crimes for a long time. Was there any sort of other appeal that made you guys want to do that? Was it like sharing the story with people, or was it finding the truth that you guys like learned about as you were going? Like, what was the main draw for this for you?
So for me, there's a couple of different main draws. One is that I love a puzzle and trying to solve a mystery. And I was a psychology major, and I really wanted to be a forensic psychologist. That was one of the things I thought about doing very seriously before I became a journalist. And so for me, it's sort of the mystery of the human psyche, not just the perpetrator, but how people cope with the aftermath, how people deal with extreme loss, how people deal with having to carry secrets for years. That all really interests me. And then trying to uncover clues and put together what really happened. So for me, that's the draw.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely comes across with the whole story, and you don't really think about that. There's the story of the actual incident that occurs, but then there's also like, there's the family stories that are going on in the background. In this case, I think there was something about somebody moved to England or something like that. I mean, there's like this whole like arcing storyline behind the incident that happened. It's really interesting how you guys sort of pulled all that stuff together as a whole topic as well. I've had other true crime podcasters on the show in the past, and there's often these times where the cases are solved and recanted. When you said that the Innocence Project tried to exonerate the person from the case as well. Why do you think that podcasting, this medium, sort of had that impact as a whole? Why do you think that? Is it like more of a connection with your fans that are sort of dedicated to all this work that you've put into it? Or what do you think is the sort of delineating factor for why these things gain so much interest?
So, I mean, I think in some cases, and this is sort of what we're dealing with because we've started season 2. So our first season of our podcast was on Jens Soren and the Hesa murders. And we're doing interviews now and researching and looking at a couple different unsolved crimes in our area for season 2. And it keeps coming back to like, somebody knows something, but they haven't, for whatever reason, they haven't been able to tell the truth. You know what I mean? To bring families closure or to bring justice to this case for these victims. And so in some cases, I do think we as podcasters are coming into these cold cases that as we talk to police officers, they've told us, we are so like our department is so small right now compared to what we had as far as like officers just a couple years ago, that like these cold cases are not getting the attention or like investigation. Like if there's a lead that comes up, they'll follow it, but no one is like truly invested in solving these crimes anymore. And so to have, journalists focusing on a crime and being able to go out and speak to people and maybe find new witnesses or talk to family members, you just never know what might break free as far as like a tip. And being able to like send something in to a podcaster or like a journalist versus telling something to a police officer, it's just, it's different. So there's responsibility with it. Obviously, as like journalists, we have to do our due diligence. But our goal is, especially with cold cases, is bringing attention to cases that are not in the media anymore regularly. And police don't have the resources to spend a lot of time on.
Yeah. Well, you said that you guys are spending like thousands of hours on this as well. Is that something that sort of pops into it? I mean, I would think crime happens everywhere. There's crimes that are happening 5 or 10 times right now in this second. So is that something where since you guys are spending all that time and developing these relationships with people, do you think there's more of like people are more willing to talk to a reporter or an investigative journalist than the police in general?
We had some good luck with our first season in finding new witnesses and being able to talk to people that were alternate witnesses that have never, or alternate suspects that had never spoken before. And I think Courtney's the analogy, you'll have to say it, but something like we always try to come in the back door. Do you want to take it from here, Courtney?
Yeah. So, I mean, like basically, sometimes you find somebody who knows something. And so, I call it like kind of crowbarring. Like you start with one person and they're like, well, I have a friend, but she doesn't want to talk yet. And it's like, but you now know that there's somebody. And so now maybe if you're patient, or maybe if you say the right thing, or you say, look, we could talk off the record first. I want you to be comfortable. I want you to understand. And gradually, as you build a relationship, you can maybe get that person to agree to talk on the record, because if there's nothing, there may not be anything in it for them. But in our first season, there is a witness who comes forward. She talks for the first time, and she's been carrying like this burden, this guilt, not that she saw the crime or had anything to do with it, but that she felt that she had seen something that nobody had really listened to her in the past. And so there was a real relief for her in finally coming forward and telling her experience for people to hear. And so, I also feel like when you make it clear to people that they are helping, and this is not just a salacious, exploitive report where we're just all going to sit around and listen to the bloody details. Like, we are trying to get something done here. And we did. We got stuff done. I don't want to spoil things, but we collected DNA. I'm not telling you whose, but we did stuff that most podcasts don't do. And we really moved the needle.
Jens Soring, who is at the center of our first season, who was convicted of this double murder in Bedford, he was my first interview. I was sent down to the prison where he is incarcerated in Buckingham, Virginia, and I interviewed him for a story for the local TV station, and he was one of my very first interviews, and that was 12 years ago. So we've definitely, and then you followed along. I mean, she's had relationships with his defense attorney and with the sheriff.
I've reported on other cases that involved the same cast of characters, and I had written about the case previously. But so I was coming in with professional relationships with a lot of the players that were supporting his case. So that also gave us a good in, to get interviews very easily and quickly, on this case.
When you're spending all this time doing everything, you said you're spending like thousands of hours doing all this research and everything. What is your sort of, after you get all of the interviews and after you get all of the data coming in, what's your writing process like on a true crime podcast? Because I'm sure there's probably more information coming in after the fact. Is that the case or no?
Yeah, we took a really different route with this first season of the podcast. Because
that's why it took 3 years.
It started off as this idea of just like a fun, let's try a podcast. Let's do this season 1. We know the players involved in this case. Let's see what we can do. So we thought it was going to be like 6 episodes. So we started in 2019, and then we started to like make some headway with our investigation. And so we're like, all right, we say, I think it's episode 6. We're like, all right, we're going to do our own investigation. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with our final episodes. And then things got crazy. And this is when we started to get DNA and these witnesses come out. And then it was also the beginning of COVID, like the pandemic. So it was like the people that were listening along with us are like, when are the new episodes coming? When are they coming? And so we'd have these big gaps. But now if you start listening, it's awesome because now we have the 18, full episodes ready to binge. But it was like a 3-year process to do these 18 episodes. And we took our time and we released like 6 episodes and 4 more. And then a couple more months went by and then we released.
And we would transcribe the interviews, and then Rachel and I would I've never done this with anyone else. It's like we would laugh and say like our brains became one brain. We would write to get like literally at the same time, we'd be writing the episode together in a shared Google Doc. And somehow we just always we always agreed. I mean, somebody might have a different idea, but I'd be like, oh my gosh, that's so much better. And I've never done that with anyone where I could actually write at the same time as them.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me to see this long sort of timeline. See, when I do this stuff, I do an interview and it's like, an hour and a half or something. And then it's like, pretty much that's it for me. It's not very hard to do, but you guys, I mean, you dedicate so much time to all this stuff. That's got to be, I mean, it's like a full-time job. Like, how is that working out for you all as podcasters with kids, no less?
And other jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the hard part has been that we, in addition to the time, the excessive, I'll say extensive because I loved every second of doing it. So it's not, I would have gladly done it, but there was no, we didn't have any guaranteed income, and we were spending a lot of our own money to make it because, there's travel expenses. Once we got to the DNA stuff, we had to fund that ourselves. There were documents that needed to be obtained and copied. There were and then there's literally just the hosting of the podcast and on the different platforms, there's having a website. So it's like, it's an expense, and we do have a business. But that has been the frustration, and that is what we are hoping to sort of sort out before we do season 2, because it's an enormous investment of time and money to self-fund and somehow still have to have a full-time job.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. I totally get that. It's a struggle. It's a weird internal struggle that people don't realize. I mean, even this side of it as well. It's a lot of work, but I will say this, your end product really, it came out well. I've been very impressed with the quality of everything that I'm listening to. I'm enjoying the entire story as it goes along. I mean, it's very it's very in depth and interesting to me. So kudos. I mean, please keep it up. I know it's a lot of work, but just hang in there. So let's switch gears a little bit. You guys have been doing this podcast for a season, but I actually found out about Courteney. I found out about you from a TikTok that you had that recently went viral with, you were talking about the Hook newspaper, which was your first, I believe you said your first assignment as well. And it dealt with this catch and kill situation. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So The Hook was a newspaper that I was actually the first employee. It started in 2002 in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we were a deep dive investigative team. And it was the most thrilling opportunity for a journalist. And it's where I learned to do investigative reporting. And I had the opportunity to do all kinds of reports on different things, not just crime, but it is where I did learn true crime reporting. And I sort of got a reputation for doing that. So it shut down in 2013. And the paper at that point had come under the same umbrella ownership as another weekly paper in Charlottesville. And for the next 9 years or so, that paper was maintaining the online archives of The Hook. So all of the 22 to 24,000 stories we had done over its nearly 12-year existence were at this website, which I used as a tool. Many people, journalists, historians, the public used, it was a very searchable site. And if you did a Google search on any topic that we had covered, it would pop right up. Well, in about late spring, late May, early June, I started getting emails from people saying, hey, the Hook site is down. And that had happened once before. So I reached out to the publisher of the other paper. And I said, hey, it looks like there's a problem with the site. Could you see what's going on and get it back up? And what I learned was it wasn't like a simple technical glitch. They had sold the archive to an anonymous buyer. An attorney had approached the owners of this paper and said, I have a client who'd like to buy the Hook archives. And what I was told is that this anonymous buyer claimed he had found a way to monetize dormant media. And so when I hear this, I mean, I was sort of stunned and outraged because, first of all, over the years, I and my former colleagues had said, if you ever don't want to maintain the site, please let us know. We will raise the money. We will give it to a library. We will do something. This is a public resource, and it's really important to make sure that it remains accessible forever. And so I was shocked. And then I heard that it was a very large amount of money that had been paid. So then I thought, the only person that would do that, it seems to me, is somebody who wants to make the whole thing go away because they're mad about something we wrote. So we started brainstorming because lots of people were mad about things we wrote. And then we tipped off the Washington Post that there was this kind of mystery. And then for the whole summer, the Hook news team came back together for kind of one last hurrah, like one last investigation. And we put out a change.org petition that got more than 1,000 signatures from people locally who were upset that the archive was gone. And we got a tip from that about this site called Lumen. And we found out that there had been challenges to copyright. So places where one particular story had been republished on other sites, the new owner was challenging those sites to try to get the story taken down from there. And that happened to be a story that I had written about allegations of sexual assault at the University of Virginia. So the Washington Post came out with this story, and I was outraged. It's not just that my work is gone, because I have copies of my stories. I can read my own stories. It was the outrage about somebody killing a whole newspaper archive to do, protect their reputation, which is what it seemed. This is what it seems like happened. So I did this TikTok, and I had a TikTok account already, but I'd been using it just for, personal stuff and, silly things. And I sat down one night and I poured my outrage into this TikTok with some visuals and the Washington Post article, and it went viral. Like more than 1.5 million people watched it. And it was really gratifying, to see the outrage that people cared about journalism and local journalism in particular. And then it also brought forward, I guess, some hacker types who were able to, download the site from the Wayback Machine and rehost it. But whoever did this, it's somebody anonymous, rehost it offshore so that they said they would not be responding to copyright challenges that the site was back. And so that's something we couldn't do. Yes, we knew about the Wayback Machine, which is the Internet Archive, but that's not something people will ever find through Google. So you can only find stories if you know they're there. You can say, oh, I know that there was this story in May of 2009, but you're not going to find it searching for a topic. So it's been really crazy and very, very gratifying to feel the response to that.
Do you really think that it was somebody trying to hide this issue? I mean, and if it's an anonymous buyer, like, do you have any insight as to who you think that could be? Do you think it's the person the story was about, or do you think it was the person, an organization?
It's the person that all, the circumstantial evidence leads to, and the Washington Post named a man named Curtis O'Forey, who was named in my article as somebody who had been accused of sexual assault by two women at the University of Virginia, and he had filed a lawsuit against me previously that was dismissed, and it was, his name showed up on Lumen. This was the one story. There were 18 copyright challenges. 14 of those 18, I believe, involved this story. So, you can't say what happened, but clearly this was the story, and this was the person that was named in that story. And so that's, the Washington Post. The Washington Post tried to reach out to him. I certainly had tried to reach out to him in the past, and he didn't respond. And he did not respond to requests from the Washington Post for comment.
So, I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. So, in my opinion, I'm a big free speech guy. And I think that the free availability of information is just so important. I'm thinking about like our education system now. Our kids, I remember where I was in my generation. I remember where I was when 9/11 happened. And it was like the entire country was like shut down. Like everybody remembers in that generation where they were on 9/11. And now like in schools, it's like a paragraph, right? And I just feel like as we go along and we progress a little bit, the availability of that information and the in-depth knowledge, which sort of ties in a little bit to your podcast, like we were talking about earlier with the hours and hours of actual research that you're doing. I just feel like that's so important. How common is this tactic of catch and kill, and what can be done to sort of keep information readily available in the future for that?
So I can't speak to how common a catch and kill operation would be, like destroying a newspaper archive, but I can speak from personal experience about the disappearance of news archives, because at every media outlet I have worked at, the archives have disappeared, and not necessarily through a catch and kill. In fact, not through catch and kill, through attrition, through the companies that own the archives not valuing them and not making sure that they are preserved when they switch from one web hosting platform to another. And so stories are gone, or they don't want to pay to host the video, or whatever it is. And if you try to find in Charlottesville, which is the market that I know, if you try to find online archives of news sites, you will not find any at this point that are really searchable. And so that's an enormous loss. Yeah, you can go to the library and spend hours poring over microfilm or microfiche, whatever, but it's not efficient. We have Google. You should be able to Google, what happened in 2002, at least for the time period after the internet arrived. And people are not, and companies are not placing value on archives as a product that is a public service.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it brings back that old phrase about he who ignores history is doomed to repeat it, And that's why I think it's just so important that something like this is valued like that. Also, it seems like the person that would be controlling all of that data, all of these stories, would have a massive, massive ethical qualm, if you will, in getting rid of that stuff, because you're deleting history, and you can sort of control, what the outline or a narrative is entirely. I think that sort of applies a little bit to journalism as a whole today. I love talking to journalists and people that sort of report and pay attention to these things as well, because you guys take more of a personal responsibility for what you're doing. Have there ever been stories that you were told like not to publish, or have there ever been any things where you decided that it wasn't the right thing to publish? Like, how does that work as an investigative journalist?
I feel like we dealt with that a lot with the first season of our podcast, really. Wouldn't you say, Courtney? Yeah. I mean, we were told to leave things alone quite a bit.
Yeah, but that was sort of by people involved in the story. I mean, certainly people don't want certain details coming out. I feel really fortunate that as far as where I have worked, I've never had a management come and say, you can't do this story because they give us too much money. That's never been overtly stated to me. And if, I think, but that may happen in other places. But I have felt very fortunate that I've been given essentially free reign to do stories as I see fit, which is not to say that people don't come and say, I really don't want you to cover this, like somebody that somebody that you would be reporting on. And I always listen, and I try to be guided by ethics and what is the public interest in this story? I try, you don't want to include details that are not necessary, that are just harmful to somebody without adding value to the story. But it's a story by story questioning process.
I know a lot of people that have just sort of stopped watching the news entirely, because it seems like no matter where you go, nobody just reports just the news. And it's really heavy in politics, but even aside from politics, it seems like oftentimes there's a lot of editorial that's added, in this modern age of journalism. And I'm talking not like, your beat guy with the little press thing in his hat from the 20s. In this modern age of Googling and databases and all of these reporting tools that you guys have, why does it seem like there's still a lot of editorial added to a lot of news stories these days? Do you guys have any insight into that?
I think I would like to separate out national media and television, sort of like television news, which is I think what people are referring to when they say you can't trust the news media, or all this stuff that's come at people. I mean, I think there's been a loss of trust, and I think you can probably tie that directly to the depletion of local news, because when you're reporting as a local reporter, you are in the community in which you live. You are a known quantity, and your reputation and people's willingness to speak with you is going to depend on their belief that you can be objective and impartial and that you are trying to tell the truth. And I think it's harder for a local journalist to get away with the kind of editorializing you might see at the national level, because we're so intimately connected with the communities that we're covering.
Yeah, I think you're right about that as well. I think a lot of that has to do with it seems like these big national organizations that you're talking about, a lot of them have to do this like clickbait thing. It's like that's what sells. You're almost selling the news. And that's one of the things that we were talking about earlier with the entire podcasting platform. You don't have to sell this. That's what I like about it's sort of the next level. I don't think people think of that like that, but it's sort of the next level of free speech, so to speak. Like when we're having this conversation right now, there's no intent behind it. It's literally just three people chatting about very important issues, what I consider. And, I think that makes a huge difference in somebody that is one having to sell a story because you're competing against other news organizations, and then also with the podcasting it's more authentic with what you guys are doing. I mean, you guys spent so much time and effort putting this into this project that you're doing that is like your little baby that you're doing, so people, I think people, there's a level of realism about that goes into what you guys are doing a little
One
further.
thing I have one thought on that, which is that yes, I mean the sort of the idea that YouTube or the podcast hosting platforms make this content accessible to anyone who has a device and they don't have to pay for it. That is true. However, these big companies do have algorithms, and they may use those algorithms to promote and further certain types of content, and that may motivate people to do sort of more inflammatory types of things that are likely to, engender an impassioned response or fuel conflict. And so I think, and then if you're somebody who's trying to make a living on a platform, you then may be more motivated to have inflammatory content because it gets more clicks.
Yeah, I mean, it applies to everything. It's all about what's selling. There's that old marketing phrase that sex sells. And I was thinking about it the other day. I saw a commercial come on for Cadillac. It's a car company, right? And there's this woman in a red dress, and she's walking out, and she says this catchphrase. She's like, "When you turn on your car, does it do the same thing for you?" And I'm sitting there watching this thing, and then I realize at the end of the commercial, there was never a car in the entire car commercial. you know and I think that same thing applies across the board to this as well. When you, like I said, when they've got all these competitions for different organizations, and as a YouTuber, I'm a YouTuber, and they actually tell you in your little YouTube analytics to pay attention to what is working and what isn't. That's how you grow on YouTube. So of course, if I say something that's controversial, it's going to be like, oh, it's starting to go up. It's starting to go up, you know? And that's a weird thing that we've got going on in the world. Do you think there's like a level of authenticity that gets sacrificed because of that, particularly with what you guys do?
I think people actually crave authenticity. And I think that authenticity can be rewarded. I think you just have to get it in front of people. And I think that I mean, there are a number of creators across social media platforms and authors like Brene Brown, for instance, or some of these other authors who are appealing to the higher version of ourselves. Trying to be better, trying to be authentic, trying to be vulnerable, trying to be truthful. I do think people want that. I just think they're also drawn to the opposite.
Yeah. You've been reporting for 15, 20 years now, you said. What do you think has been the biggest sort of change in journalism as a whole in your times as reporters?
Social media to me has been like the biggest change in terms of the way people access information.
Yeah. Do you think that's a positive or a negative?
Social media?
Yeah.
I think it's both. I think it's a double-edged sword. I mean, I think I have seen incredible power, like the Hook archive TikTok that went viral, that then motivated somebody to do something. I've also seen people get so much misinformation and forget how to think critically, and forget that journalism is not just like throwing up some words on a page. There is a method to collecting information and verifying your sources and revealing how you got the information that you got, that simply is not present in a lot of this other sort of info, whatever, videos that people are presenting almost like it's reporting, and yet the journalism isn't behind it.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that's something that needs to be addressed as well is, because of the internet, anybody can post anything. Like you can literally say anything is truth, and there's a big issue with misinformation as well. Again, you always hear that in politics, but I feel like that has some sort of you can manipulate that in either way. You can say, "Oh, well, that's," you can just brush stuff away in that aspect of it. But there's also, you know, there's the other side to that sword as well. Nowadays with all this stuff in social media, you've got like reporters that they don't even go out. They just sit there on Twitter and find somebody's thoughts, and then that immediately is put up as fact. Do you see a lot of that going on now as journalists?
I think a lot of that is going on because it's I call it like a hungry beast. It's like you have a certain amount of content that you have to create, and the newsrooms are smaller. So it's fewer people trying to create more content, and there's no other option but to create less quality content because it takes time to do actual reporting. You can't whip out an investigative report in an hour, but you can put out a listicle. You can put out top 5 reasons we love whatever. You can put out 5 of those probably in an hour when you get good at it. So
Yeah.
until we decide, until if and when, if we ever decide that it's worth the investment, and there are nonprofit newsrooms and that are growing and coming up. But if we don't invest and we don't pay people to do real reporting just won't happen.
Yeah. I've actually never heard of that, nonprofit newsrooms, but just hearing that, I love the sound of that idea. I mean, so Courtney and Rachel, you all have been doing journalism as a whole for about 15 to 20 years now, you said, and you've done all different types from print to radio to live broadcast, and now you're doing a podcast as well. So you've done sort of all of the mediums, it seems like. What advice would you have for somebody that's interested in a career of investigative journalism as a whole? What do you think that would be?
I believe that no matter which medium you are going to make your primary, you must have skills that cross platforms. I mean, and that now includes social media. But if you work for print, you should still know how to edit audio and video because you are going to want to have multimedia stories. If you work for broadcast, you still have to write print stories for the web. Same thing for radio. And so to me, and the reason that I have jumped from platform to platform, from print to broadcast television to radio to podcasting, and now I'm working on my social media skills, is because I want to remain viable in the field going forward. And I'm in my 50s now, and I know that I have to stay sharp because it is a constantly changing landscape. The skills are the same. The reporting is the same, no matter which medium you're using, but the tools you use and the way you tell the stories is different. So I say, just try to learn them all.
Sure. How about you, Rachel? You've been hanging out quiet there for a little bit.
I agree with Courtney about being a jack of all trades because there really is no such thing as just doing print or broadcast journalism anymore. You do it all. I would also say if you're interested in investigative journalism, finding a spot, it's all about like finding the right fit. So if you can find a place where you can work with people that are like-minded or people that can, and this is what I've appreciated about the podcast working with Courtney, is like I've learned so much from her as an investigative journalist. She's been doing this longer than me. And so just to have someone who can like help you grow, you want to have mentors all the time. I think that's really important. And having a place where there's some resources that will allow you to spend time working on stories that deserve attention and get, more than just a day's work is really important too.
Well, let's kick it back to the podcast a little bit. So you guys have put a ton of effort into it, and I heard that you are starting season 2. You're writing for season 2 and getting everything going with that. So what's the timeline for that? When can we expect something new from Small Town Big Crime? And what do you think? Do you have any exclusives for me? Like, what's it going to be about? Give me something.
Well, right now we're just doing interviews on a couple different cold cases in Central Virginia that we have covered over the years, and still have some big questions to be answered in these cases. And this time we're doing it a little bit differently because as we go, we are putting up some of clips of our interviews that we're doing with law enforcement, with family members, with witnesses. We're putting them up on our YouTube channel. So you can actually kind of follow along as we create this podcast. So we haven't decided on our second season, but we've done interviews and we've been posting as we go. So you can kind of like come along for the ride.
Yeah, we wanted to see which cases what would come forth from the initial interviews, because we want to make progress. And so we wanted to see, of these 5 or 6 cases that we are initially looking at, where do we think there's the potential for a real break? And where could we be most effective pushing to actually, either just move the case further along, or the dream is allow a tip to come forward that would let law enforcement solve it? Because we don't think journalists are not police, right? It doesn't help if we solve it, but police can't do anything with the results, right? I mean, what we want to do is elicit information that allows a case to be resolved through the proper channels.
Cool. Well, I like that idea of going along with the progress with you. I think that's like, me as a viewer, it allows me to be like sort of an additional investigator with you. That's kind of a cool process. That's a good idea to do that. You gave a little bit of a hint later, and like I said, I haven't finished, so no spoilers. But you said that there was some earlier. You said that there was some new information that you all had found because of the podcast. Can you give me any updates without spoiling the whole case for me?
Sure. So the case is about Jens Soring, who in 1990 was convicted of brutally murdering his girlfriend at the time's parents. And so he was in prison for the past 30 years, and since his trial maintained that he gave a false confession, that he was innocent. We covered the case as journalists over the years because he got some pretty powerful people on board with his claims of a wrongful conviction, like the sitting sheriff in our county was one of them. One of the founding board members of the Innocence Project was advocating for him and his exoneration. John Grisham, the novelist, was also invested in his pursuit of exoneration. And there was some evidence that maybe their DNA testing could show that there were other people at the crime scene. And so that's kind of where we started. And we were like, let's figure out if there are these other people at the crime scene, and if we can identify them or talk to them and figure out if Jens Soring really was innocent. And so that's what we did with our first season. And I don't know, Courtney, if you want to add anything to.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, I think we've already mentioned, we managed to actually collect and test DNA, not saying from who, you got to listen to the podcast. And we were able to expose some things that have been presented as facts in media. You've asked about like things that aren't true being presented in media or twisted. And we have been able to unravel and sort of reveal the ways in which things that aren't true have permeated coverage of this case.
Like I said earlier, I think the idea of people getting to do that along with you, I think that's really appealing. The DNA evidence as well. This is just something that sort of popped in my head. That didn't start really becoming mainstream process until I want to say like the early to mid 90s as well. So, I mean, when you're going and you're researching all these cases, is that a big hook for you all when there's all these cases that may not have had that information from way back before DNA evidence was even a thing? Like, do you think that there's how many of these sort of cold cases, so to speak, do you think there are that would benefit from that DNA evidence?
There have been such advances in DNA technology now that it is worth going back and retesting DNA if it's never been done, or if it hasn't been done even in a few years. Like in the last couple of years, cases have been cracked that couldn't have been cracked before because of these technological advances in DNA science.
One of the things we learned about, because I feel like we sort of became DNA experts trying to learn research for our podcast. And we spoke with the head of a forensic lab in Oklahoma, and he was telling us about this little vacuum that they use, and they can suck up like remnants of DNA from like swabs that have been stored in like containers, and they can like vacuum the container and pick up DNA from that. And that's just developed like in the past couple years. So it is really cool to learn about all this new technology and the way that it could be helpful in solving crimes where that just wasn't available even, 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's really impressive that you all sort of took it upon yourself to do that. As far as being like experts, because when I'm thinking of that, like I've heard of the term DNA technology, but it's really sort of more of like a buzzword. Like when you went to go do that yourself, you took this upon yourself to go find this, to go test this evidence. That was one of the things that you all put into effect. Like, how did you sort of think of that? Because I'm thinking that's something that the police do. Is that something that anybody can do?
Well, we weren't actually like testing the DNA, but we were tracking down like alternate suspects that would help like give us their DNA so that we could have it tested at a lab.
Right. So, I mean, did they, obviously, I'm assuming they had to agree to all that as well, correct? Like, what was that process like? Was that like a weird thing? Like, hey, I want to test your DNA to go to this cold case that from 40 years ago.
And one of I'm trying not to like spoil everything for you, but so in the Jens Soring case, there were these 2 alternate suspects who had been convicted of a similar crime in the area in the same week. And so they were really viable, like other possible suspects for this crime. And so they had been named in court records, like in the 90s, they had been named in interviews and the Washington Post and the like the New Yorker magazine, as being like possible alternate suspects in this case. And so, but nobody had ever talked to them. And so that's where we started, was trying to get in touch with these people, find out what their story is, like they're people and they were in prison for their other crime. And so that's kind of where we picked up with our investigation. And that led down some really crazy rabbit holes and we go into detail in all of the podcast. It takes some weird turns.
Very, very weird turns.
It's amazing where just following up on this stuff will lead you. So I'm excited to hear about it. I'm also very excited to hear about the sort of investigating the pieces that you're adding to your YouTube as well. So if somebody wants to find out about that, where can everybody find out more about the entire investigation process and what you're doing with it?
We've got the Small Town Big Crime YouTube site. So the name of the podcast, the first season is Small Town Big Crime, Jens Soring and the Haysom Murders. Now we have Small Town Big Crime YouTube. And we are posting our videos there. We also, the way currently we are trying to support what we're doing is through our Patreon, which is also Small Town Big Crime. And so that's kind of where our stuff is. And then we have a social media presence. So if people want to follow along, we have Facebook and Instagram, and I'm doing some stuff on my TikTok page, which is Court Reports.
I'm really excited about the project. Like I said, the podcast is great. I haven't finished it, but I'm on the edge of my seat.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you all for taking the time to sit down and talk with me as well. We're getting down towards the end of the episode, and at the end of every single episode, I ask all my guests the same question. It's one question in 2 parts, and normally I get a deer in the headlights look because I never prepare anybody for it. But what was the last goal that you all completed, and what's the next goal that you want to set for yourself?
Are we talking
professionally
or personally?
It can be anything. I had a guy tell me he wanted to catch a sturgeon at the lake this summer, so I was like, that's a goal.
Speaking just about our project, we have a list of goals. We completed all the goals that we set with getting this podcast out. I'm super proud of the fact that we did that. And our goals this year, my goal, I won't speak for Rachel, but we have talked about this. Our goal is to figure out how to keep doing this work. How to figure out, can we make this something that we can support ourselves through? It doesn't need to be a huge amount, but just, it's a lot of work. And so that's my goal this year, is make this work somehow or realize that it just can't.
I agree. Yeah. We've been doing
Rachel, you have the input?
4 years now, and we've been working so hard, but we've also been doing all these other things to keep it going. And we've had these conversations like, this is our year. We want to keep doing this. it's the most fun we've ever had working. Like, it doesn't feel like work, but we are really doing something and like putting out a product we're really proud of.
And getting stuff done, getting answers, like it's meaningful, So
Like, find a way, if that's through Patreon or a sponsor, that we can continue to do this.
Well, I definitely think you're headed in the right direction going on YouTube as well. If I can give you a personal word of advice, what I would do is build a community around that investigative process. Like, get people involved, and I think that would be tremendous for you guys. I think the topics that you cover, and I think the level of accuracy that you all sort of focus on, and the way that you do things, I could definitely see people getting super interested. So Misfits, go check out their YouTube channel and see what they're doing with the investigative process as they go. And I think I wish you guys the best. I think I'm really excited for what's coming for season 2 and beyond. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this guy up. Misfits, like I said, all of that information is down below in the show notes. So go check them out. I mean, find out what would happen if you could help solve these crimes that they've been talking about. I'll leave you with that. Have a great evening. Well, Misfits, we did it. That's our episode. As always, I want to thank you so much for listening, and thanks again to our sponsors. If you want to support any of our sponsors, there are affiliate links on the sponsors tab of our website over at www.misfit-heroes.com. You can also find links to all of our social media there, so be sure to follow us for immediate up-to-date info about the podcast. Please, if you enjoyed this podcast and you want to help me out, do me a favor. Hit the subscribe button down below so you're notified of new episodes as they're released, and make sure to leave a rating or review of the show on Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Truly, Misfits, I love you. Thank you so much for listening. And until the next episode, be kind, love one another, and be a hero.